It runs in real time because we actually...
Good afternoon.
We have some access to some satellite data exclusively processed out of the Department of History.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I love that we have a packed house for such a great event today. My name is Kimberly Flowers, and I'm the Director of Global Food Security here at CSIS, and I run the Global Food Security Project. And what we do here is we analyze and highlight global food security issues, tying that back to U.S. strategic interest, as well as keeping global food security high on the development agenda. And today we brought together strategic thinkers, technocrats, bureaucrats, research geniuses, data nerds. We've got a lot of big thinkers with us today, so we can have a robust dialogue. And we're going to do the dialogue a little bit different today, which I'll explain why those cards are there, because the audience, you, are going to help us drive our conversation today. I will tell you that you need to make sure you have a pen and you need to pay attention. So if you don't have pens, we have a few over there that our runners can bring to you. So why are we here? We're here to explore how the latest technologies can help us solve food security challenges. What kind of data is collected? How is it collected? And for me, the most important is, how do we use that data to make evidence-based policy decisions? You know, this is a topic that CSIS and the Global Food Security Project has been following for quite a while. As you got with the handouts, you saw a one-pager, which is a preview of a paper that we'll be producing later this summer around the topic. We're looking at it a little bit differently, looking at converging trends around dual-use technologies, from satellites to drones to sensors, and seeing how the defense and the intelligence and the development community can better share and use that data to inform mitigation strategies. You know, the U.S. government has remained a leader in innovation and in responding to global food security throughout the world. And I believe we need to continue to think big and act fast so that we can respond to a world that, as we all know, has become increasingly complex. Adoption and analysis of innovation technology is going to be critical to make that happen. Before we begin, I just want to do a quick recognition, particularly of Sarah Tish and Jeff Grieco, who are in the front here with Crown Agents USA. All of our sponsors today from Cometrica and Average 360 have been great, but particularly to Jeff and Sarah for bringing this idea forward. You know, their foresight and their leadership is really what's made this event possible. So thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you. And just to say a brief word about security here at CSIS, we want to ensure the security of our guests. We don't anticipate there will be any problems, but if there is, I am your security officer, so look to me. We have a powerhouse of lineup speakers today, so I will be very brief. We will start with an opening keynote from Andrea Natsios. And I don't believe in long introductions, and most of you in this room should already know who Andrew is and why he's the right person to do this. But I just want to point out a few things. You know, you probably know him from being the former USAID administrator, and that's very impressive, Andrew. But the reason that I think he's the best person to do this opening is because what he was doing at USAID in the early 90s, where he was directing the USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, as well as leading what was then called USAID's Bureau for Food and Humanitarian Assistance. He's also focused a lot of his career on Sudan. So he really understands this topic and can talk about U.S. food assistance, global food security, and technology, and the nexus between those three. Currently, in his role as a professor, he teaches a class on famine and conflict, and he knows better than anyone, and he'll address this, about the historical and the present linkages between food insecurity and political instability. Andrew?
Evidence-based policy, that's an extraterrestrial idea. What city are we in? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be cynical. That's a terrible thing to be. I would like to thank the sponsors of today's program on food security and famine prevention for inviting me to address the conference this afternoon on such a timely and important subject. You know I like to speak extemporaneously, but they only gave me 15 minutes, so I'm going to read. I'm sorry. The landscape of humanitarian crises is changing. Despite growing worldwide wealth and the rising economic power of the developing world, If you haven't seen The Great Surge, read The Great Surge of Steve Radlett, I would urge you to do that. We are facing more political crises now than at any time in the past, and I believe these crises will continue on to the future. Those crises are destabilizing the international order. While there are many who look forward to a multipolar world, past history suggests that such a system will be more unstable than the unipolar or bipolar world order of the past 70 years, and such a system, I believe, political crises will grow, not diminish. Great power rivalry will increase in intensity and will extend the length of civil conflicts as countries intervene to protect their national interests, as we are now seeing in the Middle East. One piece of evidence for the growing turbulence in the international system is the 60 million people who are refugees or displaced persons, according to UNHCR, the largest number since the end of World War II, and by some measures, the largest number in human history. The landscape for humanitarian crises is changing for two reasons. First, unpredictability in weather patterns and economic pressures on the food supply, global food supply, are increasing food insecurity among the world's poorest people and poorest countries. Second, because the world is becoming increasingly chaotic and with non-state actors changing the calculus of conflict and with international powers becoming more isolationist than they have been at any time in the past, in my view at least since the Great Depression, this is leading to an unraveling of the architecture of the post-World War II international system. Too many people, all of us included in my view, who work in the international system as it now exists, assume that the world order of the past 70 years, I mean the international institutions that exist, is permanent, when in fact it now faces its greatest crises. The European Union is clearly facing its greatest crises since the Second World War. The liberal international trading and political order, in my view, is at risk. Many of the most food insecure people in the world are subsistence farmers on the margins of society, where agriculture is just barely feasible enough to grow the necessary food to survive, much less prosper. Erratic weather patterns will affect those farmers worse than modern farming systems, because small changes in the climate are enough to shatter the fragile agricultural systems these farmers use to survive. And I might also add the growing urbanization. China was 90% rural in 1949 and 10% urban. It is now 50-50, and the urban part of it is growing. When people are in, most famines take place in cities, not in rural areas. I'm sorry, in rural areas, not in cities. But what's happening now is the cities are dependent on the rural areas for food production, and if they're not producing the food, the cities could be at risk too. The famine of North Korea in the mid-90s was an urban famine, not a rural famine. It is not only the farmers and their families that are at increased risk. As farms become increasingly unsustainable, the food supply in some regions of the world, not all regions certainly, may decline. As supply falls, prices will increase. We have seen over the past 10 years food price volatility rise with wide springs in prices. Abundant research now makes clear what many of us do instinctively, and that is rapid and steep food price increases over short periods of time will produce revolution in the streets, as the poor fear they will be unable to feed themselves and their families. And the polling data, by the way, from Egypt at the time Mubarak fell clearly showed this. This was private polls. The U.S. government polling data showed that. Half the population believed, because of massive food prices in the preceding 6 months, tomato prices went up 600%, meat prices went up 100% in the 6 months preceding Mubarak's ouster. Same thing was true in different ways in Syria before the revolution started there. At the same time, there are growing protectionist trends in all of the major national economies, not just the United States. The world food system cannot function efficiently or effectively if the free trading system collapses or is compromised. Trade wars will only increase the risk of food security crises. Changes in food prices are also driven by changes in the consumption patterns of developing economies. In many middle-income countries, we have to celebrate the fact there are so many middle-income countries now. Middle-income countries are demanding more animal protein. That is rising, that demand. and will result in grains being used to feed animals rather than people. These trends are entirely understandable. I'm not being critical, I'm simply saying it's a reality, and it's going to have an effect on the price of grain and the volume of grain available for human consumption. But it is not only about the supply and availability of food. Indeed, some of the worst famines in history happened while supply was plentiful. My great, who I teach in my classes, Amartya Sen, won the Nobel Prize for his entitlement theory of famines, and he disproved the food availability decline theory of Malthus, which people still apparently are being guided by when they should be reading Sen, who I think is much more accurate in his estimate of what the cause of famine is. Instead, the poor and vulnerable died because they did not have access to food for economic reasons. Sen says in the first sentence in his famous book, food is not caused by there not being enough food, it is caused by people not having enough food, which is not the same thing. Another major contributor to the lack of access is conflict. In my time as director of OFDA 25 years ago and later as administrator of aid, I witnessed firsthand too many situations where food was used as a weapon of war. In the post-Cold War period, drought and war have been a toxic mix driving at risk people to food crises and famines. It is not a new strategy, however. Hitler starved millions of people during World War II. I would commend you a book by Tim Snyder, a professor of history at Yale. He wrote two books, one on called Bloodlands, and the next one called Deadlands. And they're very disturbing books, but they deal with the issue of food in World War II. Lizzie Cullingham has done a wonderful book called The Taste of War, which catalogs the same issue. Hitler starved millions of people during World War II, but many leaders did before him as well. With the increased pressure on food resources and rising political chaos in many places in the world, food is more likely than ever to become at the turning point in conflicts. It is not simply that we know conflicts can cause famines, either by design of nefarious leaders or because markets are disrupted, but we also know famines cause conflict. So it goes both ways, both across borders and within borders. The good news is that while these pressures will contribute to a rise in the occurrence of famines, unfortunately, we know how to respond to famines and to acute malnutrition and to chronic malnutrition, not the least because of the sophisticated famine early warning system at USAID, which I have to say I'm very proud of. AID, it was created, as you know, in the 1980s after the terrible Ethiopian famine. FUSE brings together a vast array of information from price monitoring to production estimates that allow us to see the sources of food insecurity as they begin to occur, rather than after they have already done irreparable damage. I might say, I always read all of the FUSE reports while I was aid administrator because I said to the career staff, we're not having any famines while I'm aid administrator. And FUSE always, so far, at least until that point, had been accurate in predicting them, so we need to use what they tell us to make policy decisions ahead of time. Time is the greatest complicating factor in all famine responses. People do not schedule their own starvation to conform to the timeline of the international humanitarian response system. If we don't intervene through whatever tools we have available early in the sequential process of a famine, the risk of high death rates increases. Thus, famine early warning systems are the single most important technological tool we have available to catch a food crisis before it mutates into a famine. When I say we, I mean the entire international system, including the countries where the crisis is taking place. FUSE has been in place since the mid-1980s, as I said earlier, and has evolved tremendously over the years. It was an important tool when I was director of OFDA 25 years ago, from 1989 to 1991, and even more important when I was aid administrator from 2001 to early 2006. When I returned as U.S. aid administrator, we moved FUSE out of the Africa Bureau into DACHA, the conflict office, conflict bureau, which was organized to deal with complex humanitarian emergencies and famines and civil wars as well. If you put the early warning system right next to, integrated with the officers who are doing the responses to the disaster, the likelihood of success increases. Organizational structure does make a difference. If we have to rely on the national security process to make decisions, we will kill a lot of people. Those decisions should not be made in the White House and under any administration unless we need presidential help to intervene somewhere, it's best to leave it to the career officers and political appointees within DACA and the Refugee Bureau at the State Department, and not have it move up to the top level of the system. Since I left office, FUSE has expanded both in terms of its spread, and it's now in 36 countries, but also in terms of the methods for tracking triggers of food insecurity. Some of the methods available today, such as satellite imagery, estimates of crop production, and the technology to decipher the imagery, would have saved countless lives if they had been applied to North Korea in 1995, when a famine killed more than 2 million people. By the time we had sufficient evidence of the famine in early 1997, and believe me, it was not easy to get the information, 1.5 million people had already died. What was striking then, and is still today, was the political pushback against responding to the famine. It took we had all of the right information in the hands of the right people, and a great lobbying effort by the NGOs and religious communities in the United States and Europe to make the US and European governments recognize the famine was taking place. However, responding to it was another matter. So while FUSE is a powerful and important tool, there is only so much data and information that it can do for us. We have to have political will. Without political will, the system does not work. For committed humanitarians, I presume many of us or all of us here are in that category, preventing famines is driven by great moral imperative. We do not need any other motivation to save lives and alleviate suffering. However, many decision makers see famine and food crises response in the context of grand diplomatic strategy. One of the major challenges to us in the aid community is to make obvious what role food security plays in strategy, because famines and conflict are indelibly linked. I know that many of you probably do not like the idea of dealing with the messy business of politics and diplomacy, but it is necessary if we're going to do a good job in this effort. We all know that after a sudden, fast onset disaster like an earthquake or tsunami, the international support is always high, but it is difficult to ignore terrible human tragedy when it's on television. However, in a slow onset disaster like famines, that is not the case. When you see starving children on TV, it's usually too late to intervene. And I could go through the Holodomor famine in the Ukraine, or the Great Leap famine in China, where Stalin and Mao knew what they were doing. They caused the famines. They are responsible for the death of millions of people. But they also hid the famine, so we wouldn't see it. If we had had the fuse system in place in those 50 or 60, 70 years ago, focused on those famines, we would have known ahead of time what was going on. We could have intervened. We didn't know until the famine was all over how bad it was. So food has been used for a long time as a tool of war. And unfortunately, it's likely to take place in the future that it will be used in that way. It is unfortunately true that there are isolationist forces both on the hard left and the hard right that are focusing public attention on internal economic challenges while ignoring what is happening outside our borders. Rising ultranationalism will become one of the greatest long-term threats to the viability of the international humanitarian response system as countries focus exclusively on their own narrowly defined national interest and internal problems. We cannot necessarily end all food insecurity in the world. It's too complicated to do that. We should work toward it. But we do have the resources and organizational structures to end famine. And we in the aid community should make this our policy objective, to end famine as we know it in our time. It will not be easy because politics will stand in the way. We should make it unacceptable for any country to use food as a weapon of diplomacy or national strategy. And I think FUSE can help us to implement a strategy that will bring an end to famine in the world. Thank you.
Our first panel can go ahead and come up. I really appreciated a couple of remarks that I'm just going to emphasize from Andrew's, which is it's about food access, not always availability, that food is a turning point often in conflict. that food can be used as a tool of war, and that we should and can end famine. Thank you for those remarks, Andrew. So I mentioned in the opening that we're going to engage the audience in a different way, and here's how that's going to work. So you all have index cards around your seats somewhere. You can raise your hand and we can bring you more if you need more, don't worry. As the panel gets started, we want you to write down questions or comments you have. You can be anonymous if you want. You can write your name or you can write your organization on the card as well. Handwriting counts. We have to be able to read it, so think about that. We will have, as the panel gets started, this is for both panels, by the way, as the panel gets started, just pass your cards down, get to know your neighbor a little bit, and we'll have runners coming through the aisle to collect them, and they'll bring them up to me, and then I'll give them up to our moderator. And now we'll begin. Wayne?
Thank you, everybody. And please do pass up your cards. I am going to be using them to drive the session. So if you want your idea or your question to be said, please pass it up. I want to start first. It was wonderful to hear this message that the U.S. has a moral obligation to respond to famine and to respond to food insecurity issues versus having to have anything more than that. I mean, I think that's a very powerful statement. And I'm a technologist. I'm a firm believer that technology can improve the way we respond to many of the challenges of development. And I'm really excited that today we're actually going to have a good conversation around the role of technology. You all have bios of our esteemed panelists, so I'm not going to go too deep into any of one of them. But I'm going to open up by asking them questions so we can get started on this conversation. I want to start with you, Bob. We heard from Ignacios about FuseNet and that system. What are some of the other systems that the U.S. government is using to better understand and predict, mitigate food insecurity issues and drivers?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. Mr. Ignacios, you did a wonderful job, and one of the most important aspects of your opening remarks was that there are many players in this. Dealing with food security is a team sport, and there are need for many players on the team to deal with this. For instance, one of the big technology issues that we run into is that we work very closely with Fuse. In fact, Foreign Ag Service helps support Fuse in terms of personnel. We travel with them. I'm looking at my former director there, Pat Shake, who is very instrumental in making sure that relationship is solid and continues to work. So that technology transfer at the data level, at the analysis level, and at the personnel level is a key aspect of working together.
Earlier you had spoken about that you have actually international standards or international processes to look and understand famine. Could you tell us about some of those?
To look at...
or it was the World Food Index, I believe?
Yes, so we have... Both organizations use satellite imagery and weather to understand what's going on with the crops. And bringing that technology together and then trying to get that announced to the world and released to the world. That transparency is another key part of it.
So I love this concept of being able to use satellites to understand and predict the food insecurity or our food security at a global level. I actually want to now drill down to the local level. Is there a way that we can think about how to understand where food security issues are happening at a subnational or a local level? Rob?
I'm John.
Sorry, John. It's a
Get
great
that
day.
right from the beginning. I think the answer to that is with the technology we have available today, the answer is yes. So what our company does, it's called AWARE. We're an agricultural intelligence company, and was quite taken by Mr. Ignacios' comments that it's weather volatility that is starting to create the ripples that are leading to everything from human security issues to famine and food security, particularly in semi-arid areas. Now, some of this weather variability is actually what we monitor. We have a very great innovation in creating an ag meteorology data set every 9 kilometers across the agricultural earth. So some of the things that we're doing today, just to make a statement about the continent-wide and then inverting it to the field, we've been saying sugar prices are going to go up and will hit about 19 cents by the end of the summer. And today they went up another 5% and they're at 16.5 cents. The point being is we're monitoring with thousands of observations taken from satellites. We're monitoring sugar in Thailand, in India, in the Americas, in Brazil. But where we came from was building this data set to do research prioritization, and that required that we have very accurate field level data. And so where we've really done most of our work, the continental work has really just emerged in the last 5 months, was to influence farmers to actually provide, using ICTs, to send information to smallholder farmers. So we impact about 500,000 farmers a day globally now, most of those in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's just using a feature phone or a smartphone, receiving information about forecast. And the more information they provide, the more detailed the information they can get, like a crop growth stage model can give them information. So the future for the communication side and the information side, in terms of getting in front of famine, I think is we're on the cusp of a whole new generation of information assets coming into play.
I like this concept of information assets. Though I worry, I feel that even now we're living in a world where we have a wealth of data, but we may be living in a world that has a poverty of analysis. I mean, there's only so much data you can have before you are paralyzed, right? Analysis paralysis. So, Ben, can you give us some thoughts or ideas on how we can take these tetrabytes of data that we're producing by satellite and sensors, and how can we actually turn them around in a way that it's actionable knowledge?
Yeah, I think I'm going to challenge. Tetrabytes of data, yes. If we look at the relevant satellite data for agrometeorological work, it is terabytes of data. It's very hard to manage. It's hard to interpret. But going back to what Andrew said about Amartya Sen, if the primary problems are related to access, and the primary causality of famine is access related, the agrometeorological data, which is the intense data, has also got to be complemented by socioeconomic data. And one of the great things about FuseNet is that it has a uniquely collected price data throughout its history, and has created a unique resource in that sense. But I'd like to, I promised you, I belong to the nerd category, so I promise to be quite tedious. But there's another type of data which I think is a scarce commodity, and which does not allow us to really do the kind of disaggregated data that is needed on the socioeconomic side. And that is data on food security itself, on income, expenditure. And I think if we look at innovations, the basic innovations run on data. The data innovations that could help include a much greater use of small area estimation, which is increasingly being applied to socioeconomic data sets. There's a great book by Rao on that subject. I think that's very promising. I think the question is, at a local level, how can we refine the problem to a local level? I think that there's another institutional innovation that is much overdue, and that is in terms of the way people collect data. Whereas the bird in the sky with the sensor on it, collects one type of data, multiple spectrum data. We have NGOs. We have two parts of USAID collecting household data for identical household data for different purposes. We have the World Bank supported LSMS, the national data systems. None of these systems are coordinated. So there is actually a poverty of high resolution, of detailed food security information on consumption, income, expenditure. And that's something that could be addressed by the novel concept, the innovative concept of better coordination.
Yes, I actually am waiting for the day to see when the household survey person goes out and sees the village, and they get to the house, and on the house there's a wall and there's a picture, and it says, I have 2.3 children. They have eaten 3.7 ounces of meat today. My children are 3, 7, and 8, boy, girl. And at the bottom, please check off the organization by which you are from, so I know I can track who has come to my house to ask me these questions. I'm waiting for that day. Someone please take that picture or fake it just so I can use it. But in that concept of drilling down to the hyper-local, right? I'm thinking, though, that today with sensors and I'm talking here like field-based sensors, or the concept of crowdsourcing information. There's a group called Premise Data that actually has a really interesting crowdsourcing concept where they get individuals in the communities to respond and give up information and understand what's going on, and they send them a little microcredit for that activity. John, I'm wondering, is there a way that we can move down to this hyper-local concept and really understand what's happening in specific situations? I'm thinking like pocket droughts and other activities like that.
So the simple answer is yes. In fact, we're already planning on doing some of these things and are doing them, not us individually, but in these teams that we're part of. With the ag meteorology and the crop models and being able to index areas for deficits or potentially doing well, you can then target on a very localized level the questions you do ask, because it's obviously very inappropriate. It's just not the right timing. If you were to receive a survey today about your Christmas party, it's just not going to be contextually correct, whereas the week after Christmas it would be. And the point being that if you're starting to, from a library of kinds of light touch rapid questions, and obviously again the ICTs work for this very well, you would be able to target what questions to ask. Furthermore, there are obviously leaders, as you just mentioned, in areas whom you could even send the survey to their phone such that they would answer a few questions for you to keep tabs on things in a very, very different way, in a very agile way. All of this being geolocated, all of this being able to, using just big data tools and analytics, being able to combine these kinds of models to project forward literally not only the supply side, but the demand side and the current condition side. And so on a micro basis, I would suggest that, the model that you would see, say, in the United States, where a farmer, if it rains a lot in May, the seed company will call them and swap out their seed. They will be proactively saying, since I know you bought a long season variety of your maize, we're bringing you a mid-season because you don't have enough growing degree days. You can imagine a decision tree system that would work the same way, looking at inventories locally, tracking what's in health centers, tracking what's available so that you can preemptively avoid some of the acute short-term famine type events that often fall below the resolution of the more widespread sort of information systems. And the microsystems allow you to do that.
So I'm going now to the questions that people have sent up from the audience. So please put your questions on the 3x5 cards and send them up, because I am asking directly from them. Some people have put their names on the card. I'll read your name if you have, and if not, I can just ask the question. This person, I can't read their name, but...
I told you handwriting counts.
But today there was an editorial in the Washington Post around the interface of climate change and water. And essentially, the latter is a key to food security. I mean, water usage, water management, water understanding. Bob, I'm actually wondering, what systems do you have in place, or what systems do you think we should have in place that would better help us understand water consumption patterns, water distribution patterns, or the lack of water, or, as we've experienced in Washington, D.C., too much water?
Yeah, too much water. So on the technology side, specifically addressing water, what the Foreign Agricultural Service does is monitors the large lakes and reservoirs around the world. And we're using altimeter data to measure. It was actually designed for sea height change, but we're using it for inland water bodies. And those water bodies tend to be the largest ones. And we are now trying to hook up some of the satellites. The new one that NASA launched in January was JASON 3, but there's other satellites from the European side and the Indian side that we'd like to hook up together in a system to see some of the smaller lakes, getting down to, say, a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer local reservoir. Right now, we're sort of stuck at the 100 kilometer size. Those water bodies are helpful for us to look at long-term climate changes. They are helpful to see reservoir supply levels. And they are helpful because typically all that irrigated agriculture is downstream from one of these reservoirs. And the reservoir, the downstream agriculture that's irrigated, that has been traditionally a tough one for us to understand and to monitor, and we frankly need better tools. And one of those tools that we're hoping to use is a fusion product of optical and radar data.
Well, I'm actually excited on the concept of being able to use sensors. This concept of the Internet of Things, of very low-cost sensors driven mainly by the mobile phone revolution, being able to take those and put those into farmers' hands, put them into water managers' hands. So the concept that you could have a flow meter and be able to understand in near real time the water outflow from one of these lakes or reservoirs, or even groundwater production, right? And how much are we taking out of the ground versus how much are we letting come back in? I'm going to switch gears a little bit here to a question from someone from Ethiopia. And I thought that was a really interesting question on the concept of, if we think about high tech, which I'm often stuck in thinking, oh, cool, let's use the newest, shiniest gadget and see how we can work with that. What about the concepts of high tech, low tech, or no tech to be a way to predict and understand food security issues? And John, I'm going to ask this question to you because I think, like me, you might be a technologist. So how can we get a little bit beyond our technology excitement into things in ways we could mix and match low tech with our high tech activities?
I'm not sure I fully understand what the question is there, but to address it, I would say, go ahead.
So the concept are actually, beyond access to ICT, many farmers in sub-Saharan Africa use traditional means to understand climate issues. How can we provide technologies to make these farmers understand?
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. So one of the manifestations of a warming atmosphere is you have more energy, and obviously it's a giant heat engine, and the heat engine is going to do more work, and it obviously is expressing itself in this increased volatility that we've all experienced. And apparently you here in DC are not seeing the sunshine. I'm from Colorado, so we see the sunshine. My point being that traditional agriculture, I will say this, although I cannot remember what the citation, but it is said that an individual receiving better information, in this case for farming, it's literally just a forecast, will actually increase productivity 30%. Because that's literally informing someone of what not to do. Tomorrow it's going to rain, next day it's going to rain, so don't do X, or what to do. And that, in my opinion, and I'm a bit of a fan of Nassim's book on anti-fragile, this idea that it's the feedback from systems, complex systems, that keep it healthy. I would suggest that just getting a forecast to a smallholder farmer increases food security significantly. And we have the means to do it now globally. There is no excuse to not enable a smallholder farmer to get just whether it's going to rain tomorrow or the next day, or high winds or anything, because they will simply optimize their behavior. And we see this. We see it even farmers checking other locations, because that's where they're going to walk to. They're going to go visit family, and they want to know whether it's going to be raining there, because that will affect their logistics. So I think for traditional agriculture, there's actually a lot you can do and make a big step forward just connecting a cell phone to an information system that's providing a simple forecast.
So I actually really love this idea of the person having agency over their food security versus having be a passive recipient. And I also love that you brought in the concept of climate change and global warming. Unfortunately, some of our politicians don't believe that this actually happens, so theoretically it doesn't exist in the US political spectrum, but globally we actually do have to worry about it. And in this concept, Ben, I'm wondering, you've done socioeconomic modeling. How have you seen, or how have you been able to predict or trying to predict the way people respond to climate activity? And what ways do you think there could be a better response to climate action? That came off a some of the questions I moderate a little bit to make them flow better. So hopefully that was an understandable question.
The second part, was, I didn't quite get, but I think one of the interesting areas where I think where innovation there's a great deal of scope for innovation is in actually looking at the intersection between the climate data sets and the socioeconomic data sets. And I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I mean, I'm going to get a little bit nerdy on this one, but
live on the edge.
You know, we've got statistical data which is typically collected as sort of for shape, for a polygon. We've got the remote sensing data, which is typically collected for specific as a specific resolution. It's basically pixels. Then we've got market data, which is collected for points, and we've got a lot of the real insight into what's happening at a local level is somewhere between what's happening to markets, what's happening at the health and welfare effects, and the climatic effects. I mean, I think there's a lot that can be done in terms of new methods for essentially merging these data sets and using multiple data sets. And now, you know, that many more data sets are properly georeferenced. Systems speak about common timestamps. I mean, basic stuff about how data are coded, timestamps, location information. It allows a huge additional possibilities. I think there's also underutilized potential for micro-simulation. A lot of people, have doubts about the sort of veracity of micro-simulation models, but there's still a great deal of scope in terms of how the local effects, the local socioeconomic effects of variability in climate can be modeled. I think it's an infant industry and one with great potential. But I'd also like just to go back to, I'm trying to balance everything, give the economist's perspective on everything. Also in terms of the location, in terms of getting local, I also believe that local knowledge of market prices, there's huge potential for getting really local market price data, through being able to sort of mine transactional data. So if we were to have a situation where, where John's farmers are trading on their little SMS system,
That's perfect.
then we're able to suck those prices out. We can mine that transactional data and get a much more sort of granular understanding of prices, and that's again something that's not really being done. We talk about big data, but I mean, if you're a price analyst in Africa, big data it seems to be a far off dream. But I think that's.
Well, there's a follow-on question that someone brought up, which I think is great for this. Back to you, Ben. What role, if any, does qualitative data, such as socioeconomic perceptions and coping strategies, play in your modeling?
Was that deliberately targeted to hurt me? And so I'm just the wrong person to answer that question. But I mean, okay.
Qualitative.
There's okay. We have to face a basic fact that decisions are made. I mean, I think Mr. Natsios clearly referred to his initial cynicism. Let's say decisions are made based on evidence somewhat, and hard evidence the hard quantitative evidence always needs the qualitative contextual information for it to be able to move from saying, okay, well, that's what the figure says, but how does my gut respond to it? And I think the qualitative information provides the context, it provides the reality check. It's often also a form of triangulation against the quantitative data. And most decisions, you get these classic decisions in the food in the food security space, where you have donors thinking one thing, domestic governments thinking another, the local NGOs crying out and saying something else. And you have these impasses in terms of responses over the numbers, the quantitative numbers, and it's the qualitative data, it's the common understanding of the context that actually allows you to overcome the impasse and it actually allows you to trigger the policy response. So begrudgingly, I will admit that the qualitative data is actually, it's a necessary complement for policymakers to the hard numbers, I think.
Thank you for having a tough question on qualitative.
Yes, please. I sweat it.
Bob, I want to come back to you, because I actually want to shift here and think about, I think often when we think about food insecurity, we also often think about weather, and weather being a huge driver. I want us to go a little bit beyond that and think about conflict, disease, migration. Are you using tools of technology, or what tools of technology could you use to better understand how those drive food insecurity?
Those are the tough ones, to be honest with you, because
that's why I asked the tough question.
There you go. Specifically for the Foreign Agricultural Service, we're dealing with the nation as a unit when we forecast and estimate production. And oh, by the way, Happy New Year, because our estimates came out yesterday for the new year. So, but when you get into a subnational or migratory groups, or in a conflict area, for instance in Syria, where you have different groups controlling different resources, this is much tougher to do. And what Ben was saying about the integration and the intersection of different types of data sources is where we are able to at least get some sort of picture, maybe a fuzzy picture, but a picture of what's going on. They have, with the satellite imagery, you're at a pixel level, but you also need to know what the farmers want to do, and then who's providing inputs to the farmers. And in case of Syria, again, it's who's controlling the fertilizer supply. That's been a big focus of the discussions about wheat production. And in different areas, it's controlled by different groups. They're very, very tough questions, and it takes several. In our world, we use several different agencies that get together and discuss these issues. AID, State Department, NGA, ourselves, and we try to come up with the best estimate that we can for some of these conflict areas. Very difficult.
Good. You wanted to...
Yeah, earlier you mentioned something called a pocket drought. This is a term I use to describe these areas, sometimes 150 kilometers by 100 kilometers, where the rains just fail. And our data sees that. And last year we had a really interesting case study of eastern Niger, near the area of Zinder. Zinder normally produces sorghum pretty well. And one of the experiences that I want to make clear about comparing current year to the normal, to whether the last 10 years normal, is the normal is what a farmer is setting themselves up to succeed with. So I will point out that any variability is bad for agriculture. Because even if it's a really good year, they've still planted semi-arid varieties in a certain spacing. They're only going to get a certain yield. And of course, Zinder last year, the rains failed. What then began to cascade, and I don't do the population data, but we shared our data with some groups that do, and they have on-the-ground resources collecting information from even health clinics in northeastern Nigeria. And you also know that's a Boko Haram area. And the subsequent map that came out of that was astounding. Basically, all the, they use a special term for, it's not an economic, a refugee. We're all in the areas that got rain. And the attacks and the destruction of granaries, and all it was all where there was rain, because of course thieves aren't going to go someplace where there isn't anything to take. But the point being is, I imagine that had you had in place a system of querying the area around these pocket droughts, you would find disaffected persons, you would find health systems being overwhelmed, right? Because a health dispensary is only going to have enough inoculations for that local population's expected needs, and all of a sudden you drop hundreds or even thousands more people in there, that disappears, and even the local population. You can imagine the conflict. And so there's a group called the Peace Tech Labs. One of the directors there just produced a blog like a couple of weeks ago where he referenced this work in the context of their work. So when you get into conflict resolution, I think there's a lot of energy around becoming more local, because that's where they start, and the cascading effects of economic or disaffected persons coming into an area that's already a bit strained causes this cascading strain. And I think getting more local is going to help, because the more you're able to ascertain what's going on, the more likely you could use the appropriate intervention at the appropriate time and place. And I think that's what's important.
That reminds me of an interesting study I read around using call record locator data. So where someone makes a phone call from. And they looked at a population and they were able to predict where the population would move to at certain times of the year. Or if food insecurity happened or another trauma happened to the community. I mean, it's this really simple concept. So think about it in the US context. If I know where you were on December 25th, and then something happened to you or your family anytime in the remainder of the year, I could reasonably predict that you would probably go to wherever you were December 25th, right? So, where were you at Christmas? You were with your friends or your family, and that would be most likely your first place to go to if you couldn't stay in your own home. Now, you can contextualize that to other countries, but this kind of concept of using other data to understand where people are moving to.
Yeah, if I could just...
And I was actually going to go to that. So yeah, I'm thinking also, what kind of modeling have you done in thinking about things like his point of if you have surplus rain in one area or a condition, a driver of food insecurity in one area, let's say maybe disease outbreak, are you all looking at modeling of where people move from there, or being able to predict the migration patterns in response to famine situations?
Well, I have done a little bit of work on this area on a slightly back burner project, but from a satellite perspective, I still believe, I've tried and failed to do it, but I still believe that that for rural communities, there are uses of nocturnal luminosity data that ought to be able, which should allow you to be able to track bush nighttime fires, for example. I've not managed to, I've not succeeded in doing it myself, or in getting reliable predictions, but that's partly because of my limited skill set in that area. But I think the mobile data offers a possibility, but in a lot of the areas, I'm thinking, maybe parts of Sudan, Somalia, and so on, where you might really want that information, the people are reticent about using cell phone coverage is limited. You might get a very biased, the populations that you might be most interested might be those that are least likely to use cell phones. And I think we have an analogous problem in conflict areas for understanding migratory patterns to a basic intelligence problem. We've gone way to the tech side, but you still need boots on the ground. I think you need a sort of almost like you need covert but humanitarian intelligence in a lot of there's a lot of situations now, from Aleppo to a number of others that I would like to mention but can't, where you basically need boots on the ground. There's also, a lot of the communities that are most vulnerable are pastoral communities, and modeling the movements of pastoral communities is notoriously difficult, but increasingly pastoralists are using cell phones. So it would possibly, I'm saying it's going to be possibly possible to monitor, to get some insight into population movements from cellular data in the pastoral areas.
So actually, I was just reading this morning about a work with pastoralists in Ethiopia, and an organization was giving them satellite data, so they'd understand where the rains are falling, so where to graze their animals. But it was really interesting, your point of they're reluctant to have cell phones. Most of the time the pastoralists don't have cell phones, and they definitely don't have laptops. So how is this organization giving them this data? They were printing out the satellite maps and handing them to them, so they had a printed satellite map. And I think that's a great example of high tech to low tech and making it relevant to what people can do. But speaking about migration, actually I wanted to go to you, Bob, in the concept of there's, as Nacios was saying, there's a huge migration to cities, right? And while traditionally famine may have been a rural activity, in the future it's most likely going to be an urban one. How have you been working, or have you been working to try to understand the urban context for food insecurity? And if you haven't, you can punt it to one of your fellow panelists.
Consider it punted.
Okay, is anybody working on the urban? Yes, you're going to take that one?
Well, yeah, so, no, there's no one else, okay. So I think there's a couple of major issues with urban food security. It is an emerging nightmare, an emerging time bomb, and there's also it's broader than just urban. There's also a huge emerging peri-urban problem of communities, in especially pastoral communities, that because of the limitations on rangeland have been congregating around these small urban settlements. And it is a major problem because the standard assumptions about vulnerability, for example, and how people might be affected by drought just don't apply. And there's also a problem of data. There is a problem of data. Some of the products that we can use, for example, the Landscan population data sets, which give us reasonably good estimates for rural populations. For the kind of crowded urban slum populations, for example, they give, really fairly lousy estimates of populations in urban areas. But not enough is being done to capture data about the urban food insecure, and that is, I think that's a global problem. And the technology is there to do it. It's just that the problem, I think, is largely overlooked. In countries, in so many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that is a time bomb. That's the time bomb that's just waiting to explode.
John, I want to ask you a fun question here. This one
yes.
to the audience.
Fun one.
Yes, he already had qualitative data, so I'm asking you a different concept here. What happens when indigenous knowledge contradicts digital weather data? How do you discern which is better? And I think even a better question of this is, are you, or can we include indigenous knowledge in our data systems?
Well, the simple answer is, you almost have to include some digital or some indigenous knowledge. I think what's happened, though, and this is an important perception, the weather system's changed. And we find it in the US. Some of the older farmers are the least likely to believe that a piece of new information is actually more accurate than their 40 years experience on that field. And that's actually a barrier to the adoption and utilization of new technology. And I really want to emphasize this, folks. We get approached by the insurance industry, and they want to use 30 years worth of data. And I'm telling them, you're introducing 20 years worth of noise. And they don't want to hear that because there's strong statistical reasons. But I'm saying the last 10 years have an increase in volatility that is not reflected in the previous 20. And if you use 30 years, you will be so overexposed, you'll go bankrupt. Okay? Now, that's being fairly trite. But I think a lot of the interesting things about big data. So here's one for you. So if you have an indigenous knowledge in one location that's used to getting, the knowledge is tied to, I'll make one up, a semi-arid type environment. You have an environment over here that is, say, not semi-arid normally, but this year it is. You do what we would call a geographic analog, and you say, look, what these guys do over here works really well under these conditions, and you communicate it that way. But that's a big data thing that we do all the time. I mean, all of you look at your phone to map your route home for driving and traffic in real time, and you're using information that is stretched out from other people reporting things, right? Because other people's cell phones are stopped at that area and not over here, and that's how you know it. So there's ways of transferring knowledge and information about adaptation to what the environment's giving you now that isn't necessarily tied to telling someone that they should continue to grow maize in an area that they would do much better with sorghum or millets. But that requires a market, requires a look at the whole value chain. But it's very difficult to take good, indigenous, appropriate knowledge and try to explain to the person that it's no longer appropriate for this environment. That's a very difficult social construct to have to address.
So we've got one last question, and this is for all three of you. You'll have one sentence or so to answer it.
Uh-oh.
So, and I'll answer it first, so you have time to think of your great answer. The question is, how can we use technology to bring end to famine in our time? Building off Ignacios's great declaration to us. And I'm actually most excited about digital financial services, so mobile money, mobile credit, as a very wonderful tool to combat food insecurity, in the sense that we can move from a concept of, well, we'll just give them food, so food availability, to giving them cash or giving their own resources so they can have their own self-agency to combat food insecurity in the way that they feel is the best way to do it. And it also, I feel, is a way to give power back to the people who really should have it the most. Want to go next?
Okay, I'm going to give the weak answer, which is that, I mean, technology in the long run, in the short run, will work in so many different ways to ending famine, whether it's in terms of economic development or in terms of alleviating short-term suffering. I'm just going to focus on the short-term suffering. The great opportunity for technology now is a proper integration of early warning information into known response mechanisms. We know how to stop famine. What we don't know yet how to do, and it's what it's what any clothes retailer knows how to do, is how to tackle these massive surges in demand, how to integrate early warning with supply chain responses to make sure that we don't have a call forward to Houston, which is going to trigger a response, which is going to get, and basically an inappropriate commodity on somebody's table 6 months down the line. So it's the integration of early warning and supply chains in my mind.
John?
Well, I like very much what Ben just said, because the way I would answer is actually a blog I wrote a while back. You need symmetrical information across the ag value chain, across the chain. Because if the input providers and the researchers and the farmers in other areas and the markets all are essentially functioning off good information across the value chain, what happens is places that have surplus know they have a market and places that have deficits.
Right.
And literally you're able to stitch together an information. I believe, and I'm I'm paraphrasing Taleb. He says, in complex systems, it's the information that dampens the size of the oscillation of the response to any particular black swan event, to use his term. So that's a very poor paraphrasing. The guy's really smart. I'm just saying, I believe that as we improve the information and the symmetrical, you will achieve the integration of what Ben just said.
So we're on the cusp of adding a lot more technology on the satellite side, especially with the European Union and the US and their collaboration efforts. But it's only a partial answer because the thing that is needed for the satellite imagery is good ground truth. So not only the symmetry that you're talking about across the value chain, but it's also the symmetry between folks who have the information in the field and folks who have the information from the satellites. And that's the integration that I think will help enormously.
Love if you give a good round of applause to our panel. And also, thank you for so many questions. They were great.
No?
Yeah, fantastic questions. More than I expected. If you need more index cards, let our runners know, because we have a whole other panel that's coming up now. Come on up, Sarah. So as our second panel gets sorted, I'm just going to make a couple of sort of housekeeping things as well. You probably noted on the invitation or on the agenda that we have a reception afterwards, and so we're rewarding you with a great reception after hanging out in a room for 2.5 hours listening to an intellectual debate. So please continue to stay with us afterwards to continue to network and expand that. So I'm going to throw a question out to you as the audience as well. We know, as we learned from the first panel is really kind of about technology, right? And we know that we can use technology to better predict food security. We know that we can use these predictions to better make food security policy. So my question to you is, if you had to choose, if you had to pick between one or the other, which do you think that we need to have a greater emphasis on? And that is, do we need better information or do we need better policy? So what I want you to do as you think through that question is during our reception after our final closing, I want you to try to find two people, which shouldn't be hard, that you don't know, and talk to them. That's the hard part for some people. I want you to find someone who maybe agrees with what you think on this topic and find someone who doesn't, and use that to spark a conversation. Again, what do we need more on? Is it more technology or is it more on policy? And now we'll go to our second panel. Sarah? And continue to do the questions and add them up as we did before on the cards, okay? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kimberly, and welcome everyone. Is this working? Not hearing the proper thing. Okay. Thank you, Wayne and Ben and Robert, for really thoughtful discussion and insights on how data related to food insecurity can be picked up in greater detail and efficiency with technology. And I particularly liked the emphasis on the local, because these amazing technologies bump right into the very human reality of turning data into good policy and implementation. So that's what we're going to talk about this panel, okay? And I'm very grateful to Chris Burns. I'm just going to tell you the titles of the people who are here, just in case you've mislaid the bios, okay? So Chris Burns in the middle is the Senior Coordinator for Digital Development for Feed the Future at USAID. And Margaret Roach, who is next to me, is a geospatial analyst at with the Geospatial Capabilities Advancement Division at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And Deirdre McGrenna is the Chief Americas Liaison Officer at the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So again, a very diverse panel who can speak about the policies and institutions angle. So again, we're going to operate the same way we did before. Thank you for being here, and we really would love it if you could stay through the whole thing if you can. And panelists, if you want to amplify on each other's comments, please do. So I gave the panelists 2 questions beforehand, and we're going to go through those, and then I'll take the questions from the audience, and we'll cycle through. So this panel is comprised of food security data consumers, that would be Chris, and policymakers and analysts, right? So you've been at your jobs for a while now. How has the influx of data coming at you changed your job and the way you work? And can you tell us a little bit about when that tipping point may have occurred where you were like, oh gosh, things have changed now? Because that'll give us some insight into how the institutions we work with are actually having to deal with the fantastic data that's coming out of these incredible technologies. So who wants to dive in first?
You want me to jump?
All right, Chris.
All right.
You have that look.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to CSIS for hosting us today, and for all of you, both here in the crowd and online listening to this. We're grateful to be a part of it. Quite frankly, it's made our lives more challenging. It's harder for now. And I think it's harder for now because we have so many data points and pieces of data and information that we now require a greater number of experts who can track the trends and analyze all the insights and then package those and redistribute them to decision makers and communities on the ground. And we equate this dynamic to that of sensors versus sense makers. We're really compelled and energized by data and evidence, and we believe that there's a huge component to it. But more of it actually can be a little bit challenging in the absence of sense makers who can do that validation and that translation and be able to make sure that we're contextualizing it to what's going on, either through an emergent crisis or an ongoing pattern of food insecurity, and actually making it useful. And I think you need to strike that balance. And right now it's tipped more towards the sensors side and the data available than being able to do what we need to do with it. And a lot of this came out in the first panel. We'll just provide, I think, a little more nuance to it. There's a deeper level here beyond that, though, and it's that if we want to make the information useful to the end user, and you can define that as the farmer in a local community or an implementing partner doing a larger intervention, that you actually can't do it without an understanding of and doing something deliberately about the enabling environment. And the enabling environment, puts everyone to sleep right away. But there's something really powerful there that if you want to make this useful, and yes, people might have phones in their pocket and the tools there, but they're not maximizing the tools because of issues of digital literacy or lack of affordable connectivity to make those devices work. So you actually have to look at it packaged in that manner. And I think we saw that in the context of our response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa, where we saw that the lack of collection services and information communication technologies for either for contact tracing or for communicating with health officials and volunteers on the ground slowed down the response and our ability to put an end to it. So we've actually looked at Liberia and West Africa to say part of the challenge there wasn't this spread of reliable communications infrastructure, and there wasn't a real-time opportunity to make use of available data. We're now having this play out in another context. We're taking a lot of our digital development work and we're bringing it to bear in the President's Feed the Future initiative, because we're saying, yes, people are using weather data for food security programming on the ground. Sure, they're delivering extension information, but they're doing it here, they're doing it there. They might have some visualization, some geospatial that they're using to make the reports more effective, but nowhere are they tying it together and then bringing in the enablers that allow these tools to really be maximized by those who really need to. So I think that's where we're coming at it. I would say as far as the tipping point, and the last thing I'll say here is, for me, it's being reached and re-reached all the time. And that's because we are at this point where we are drinking through a fire hose of data that's available, and we're seeing more services and products come online that is responsive to that, and we're seeing the greater uptake of mobile adoption around the developing world. You package that all together, it's really fast-paced in a bunch of complex environments, and we're just seeing this, I think, refocused time and again.
Thank you, Chris. Well, you brought up a bunch of really important points, which I hope all of you are thinking about and will bring up as questions. Margaret, if you don't mind, I'm going to call on you. You handle a lot of data and you look at a lot of data, I think.
It's true.
So
I would say that
for you?
all the data has made our job more challenging. And I want to start with the tipping point aspect of this. NGA has always been a technical organization.
NGA is?
The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency.
Okay.
And so we've always been a technical organization. And our changes and upgrades have always been incremental. We've had enough dwell time to get used to systems, get used to processes, and now we don't have that. We don't have time to get used and comfortable to a certain methodology or a certain process. And so now we're just always changing, which is good because there's always new data to incorporate, there's always better models to run, and so part of our change has been how we can quickly adopt these things and quickly ingest them. And so one of the things that we're doing is changing our technology to better ingest data, including in 2 years, we're going to have all of our data and applications in a cloud environment. We're changing our acquisition and development methodology as well. The buzzword of the day is DevOps, and so we're transferring to that methodology. And so once you kind of have this space to actually look and play with your data, you can actually start to grow your scientific capabilities as well. We have a new data scientist group that was recently stood up. I mean, in some respect, we've always had data scientists, but now they actually just officially have that name. And so we're also trying to grow that through correct hiring practices and also through training the analysts we already have. But one of the big changes after getting the data environment prepped, getting the data, and having the people to analyze it is meeting user expectations. Our policymakers, our war fighters, everyone has access to the really cool New York Times graphics machine. And so we have started to develop interactive products. We've service-enabled data so that people can actually touch data, bring it down, use it on their computers. And what our our big push now is open source and pushing out more platforms for people to use their own data in. And so we have an Apple and Android app that is called the Disconnected Interactive Content Explorer. DICE is the acronym that people actually say. And basically, it allows users to load interactive content onto a mobile device, and then use that interactive content away from a network. And so it allows for low bandwidth users or no bandwidth users to still have that data out in the field. And the cool thing is that we also have that code up on GitHub. We're actually the first IC agency to put code for our stuff on GitHub. And so that was a big change. That changed a lot of our policies. We had to really consider how we wanted to do that. But now that we've done it, people can't wait for more. And so I do want to plug one more thing. There is a tool out there, also on GitHub, called GeoQ, and it's a way to coordinate disaster response data. And so it's a crowd sharing framework that can be accessed on desktop or mobile. And again, it's also on GitHub, so people can take the code, change it to suit their needs. But we also have a browser edition so that people can just go to the website and create their group and get going. So that is definitely a big change for NGA and really the IC, and so the intelligence community. And so we're really pushing towards transparency.
Wow. It sounds like there's a lot of transformative technology going on there. And both of you have mentioned the need for these sense makers. Are the sense makers, before we go to Deirdre, the same as the data scientist? Or is that something different?
I would say data scientists are a subset of the sense makers.
Okay.
Because you almost need a translator from the data scientists to the people who write the reports, to the people who actually talk to the policymakers.
Okay.
So you kind of do need that group activity.
I would concur. I think part of the challenge of working with more data right now is something that came out in the first panel. It's this coordination piece, especially if you're trying to make it useful for decision making and then to change what's actually happening on the ground in near real time. Then there are a set of coordinators in that process. The data analyst and the data scientist is going to be one of those, as is the policymaker, as is on the ground program analysts and even the service providers that are feeding into that. So I think there are a lot of sense makers, and there's still room to grow for them to work more together.
Okay. Thank you. So Deirdre works for the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And the reason we're so excited for having her here is because she is actually trying to build the bridge between, sets of data and people who create data and analysis, and to use a really Washington wonky word, stakeholders, the users, people who are affected by decisions that might be made with these data or to bring it back home to a point that Wayne was making, where these data could empower people to make their own decisions and use their own resources. So Deirdre also just came from the Conference on Indigenous Peoples in New York at the UN. So can you tell us about data coming at you and when the tipping point occurred and how has that affected your job, your world?
Originally, when you asked the question was, has the increased availability of data made your job harder or easier?
Yeah.
And I had decided I was going to answer yes. Because I'm argumentative, and I'm going to say it made it easier, because the data availability, you can't argue with data. So when I go and I try and influence, advocate for certain policy processes, if I am backed up by data, which is prepared, collected, analyzed, scientificized, or whatever it is that is done in the halls where you guys work, that gives me credibility. That gives me something that people cannot argue with. You cannot argue with data that says that there are about 8,000 children who die from conditions related to malnutrition. You can't argue with that. Okay, so it has made my job easier. It has also given me the realization that the job is hard, because the amount of data and the analysis done on the data has highlighted an awful lot of interrelatedness. And we come back to the question of coordination. You have got to have coordination. There is so much data available out there, but are we considering the whole range of stakeholders, to use the wonky word? And I would say that perhaps not to the extent that we should. For me, the stakeholders go right from the donors, be they public or private, the policymakers, the data collectors, analysts, the agricultural and rural development experts, but also very, very, very much the target groups and the indigenous peoples. And I want to share with John, I can't find him now, I hope he hasn't left. We have a publication on the importance of traditional knowledge and the possibilities that can be the harnessing of that traditional knowledge and marrying it with the technological expertise, because neither one is the answer. And the answer lies somewhere in the middle and somewhere where we can find a combination of both. An understanding of the stakeholder, the indigenous peoples. We have the indigenous peoples in the Puno region in Peru, and they decide when and where they're going to plant their crops based on pest infestations, or when the animals are mating, or when an animal appears, or when plants begin to flower. It's knowledge that, yes, can be improved with technology, but it's knowledge that has been built up over generations. And I think an awful lot of the time, well-intentioned development practitioners can come in with these wonderful new technologies and try to apply, and we listen in order to respond rather than listening to understand. And if we understand, then our response is going to be much more targeted and much more impactful.
So maybe the understanding is part of being a sense maker as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Lovely. Thank you. All right. Now I'm taking questions from you all. And I'm going to start with one still related to data. And this is, and I'm going to insert a word. No one gave their name on this, but I am going to insert a word here. How do you keep findings of geospatial data mining, I think, out of the wrong hands of those with negative motives, whether criminal, drug, terrorist, or something? I'm going to add in data pirates. So how do you do that? I mean, you're obviously two of you are dealing with a lot of data, and one of you is sharing data and making those connections through IFAD to make sure that host country governments and donors are talking to each other. So who wants to take that one on?
Well, I guess I'll start.
Okay, Margaret.
One of the approaches that we're taking is, I had mentioned the two applications. Those don't come with data. You provide your own data. And so that is an approach that we've taken. And that is one of our main avenues. At the end of the day, NGA provides a lot of base data, and so we provide a lot of like safety to navigation data for mariners and aeronautical people. And so that kind of data, we want people to have. Right. Everyone should have that type of data. And so one thing that we do is just in our policies is create an environment where we're not necessarily providing data that we wouldn't want anyone to have. I don't think that last sentence quite made sense, but I guess what I'm saying is we only put out information that anyone can have access to.
That you don't think could be done mischief with. As Andrew was saying, where information about food or food security could be used in an inappropriate way.
Exactly.
Okay, Chris?
I think it's a legitimate concern. I think I'd add one more category to that, and that's just for broader consumer protection too, especially for people who have not had an online history or perhaps haven't engaged with digital technologies for a long time. There is still a huge need for consumer awareness and advocacy to make sure that they aren't victims of fraud or nefarious business practices or unsolicited information. I think that's all part and parcel of this. And I know there are a couple of ways to approach this. I'll try to channel as much as I can the work of our Geo Center within our Global Development Lab. But I know that even when information and data is geotagged or geolocated, when the analysis is done, and this is often the case, that they'll end up anonymizing and aggregating some of it so you get the contextual nuances and the information that you need to make correct decisions on the fly, but you won't actually be personalizing that information and exposing it to anyone who might be using it for malfeasance.
Okay. And Deirdre, from IFAD's perspective?
From our perspective, I would say we look at it from the opposite side. We've heard here that food can be used as a tool for war. Food can also very much be used as a tool for peace. And if we manage to take on, we're also speaking about how to respond quickly to impending disasters or even ongoing crises. We also very, very much need to focus, and we need data and we need analysis for this. We need to focus on a collective long-term effort. Because if we keep responding quickly to crises and not responding to the root causes of famine, which is food insecurity, which is it's so central to so many aspects of development. It's a cause and a consequence of conflict. It's a cause and a consequence of displacement and of migration, which is such a big problem in Europe and around the world at the moment. So I would tend to look at it more from, we need to see food security and addressing those issues as a tool for peace. We need to have a long-term approach. We need to address the root causes, and it needs to be collective.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, another question from the audience. Okay, this harkens back to some of Andrew's comments, and this is from Chris Bilecki from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so the core of this question is, how can you expect host governments, think Syria, Somalia, or Sierra Leone, to allow you to use technology, the same technology that might cause their regimes to fall, like Mubarak and other leaders did during the Arab Spring. And I think you'll recall that one of the sort of test questions I gave you also harkened back to this, is how, okay, there's good data that has a lot of trust attached to it. How do you work with the stakeholders, the consumers, which if it's official data is going from government to government or through an international body like IFAD. So how do you address the issues of privacy, security, protection, regime security? You know, how do you work with we're trying, look at the relationships you have with host governments and that dialogue, if you haven't, or how do you anticipate it? Can you answer this question?
I can try.
It's a good question, but I don't know if it can be answered.
I don't spend a lot of time on democracy and governance issues, so I'm not going to weigh into whether or not Twitter should be shut down during times of intense violence or uprisings. But if we buy into a belief that there is a value chain for data analytics and that there is a fundamental need to continue our engagement with host governments, what I would say is it's really critical to understand who has comparative advantage and what an entity's niche is. And I'm talking in the context of donors, be they multilateral, bilateral, private, state governments, local governments, private sector actors, any of these folks. We should really be recognizing what each of us do well, from data collection to packaging to dissemination. So what I would posit is donors, for example, should not be in the business of distributing data and information. They probably shouldn't be in the business of building the systems that do the analysis. These systems exist, they're available, many of them are low cost, no cost, and they work well. Donors are great at gathering information and analyzing it and figuring out what we should do with it. Distributors like Twitter or Facebook or Google or whomever don't want to be sourcing the content either. They just want to be serving as a distribution platform. So I think when we're engaging with governments and they're trying to evaluate the potential benefits that such technologies afford, I would start at it and come to the table saying we each have a role. We're trying to build upon whatever the development agenda might be for a nation. We don't want to over-glamorize the role that such technologies can play. They are a tool to any different ends available. And let's bring that in and figure out how to embrace and maximize the tool that's not going to be seen as something that's really jeopardizing what they're trying to do. I hope to come back to this question as we get down more to the community level there too, because I think there's a trust issue there that we can address as well. So I'll come back to that.
Okay. Deirdre?
I think the trust issue has to a certain extent been addressed psychologically with the Sustainable Development Goals, because they are global. It's not like the MDGs, which were specifically for developing countries and which could have felt like a big brother developed donor country looking over the shoulder of little brother developing country. These are global goals. The title of this event is Transforming Global Food Security. It is a global issue. I was just in New York. I can't remember, it was some news bulletin that was on that was talking about food insecurity in New Jersey. And one of the counties in New Jersey that had something like between 15 and 19% food people who were considered food insecure, either didn't have access to enough food or didn't have access to the right sort of food, nutritious food. So it is global. So to a certain extent, the Sustainable Development Goals are which were adopted by all 193 member states. All 193 member states signed on to a compact to end hunger, to achieve food security and improve nutrition, and to promote sustainable agriculture by 2030. And they're held accountable to that. And part of data has a big role to play in promoting that accountability and transparency. So it's, I think the trust issue is there, but if we move more towards country-led development and country-led ownership of development, and therefore work to build the capacity and strengthen the institutions in country so that the data is actually collected and analysed in country, I think we will move towards a more open environment and a more trusting environment from that point of view. I don't know if that answered your question, but
It's great, and I'm actually very glad that you mentioned the SDGs and the MDGs, because as you know, globally, that there has been a move more toward, using evidence to make decisions, to collecting data, and gauging whether or not progress has been made. And of course, there are many discussions around the definition of progress and who's collecting the data and the quality of the data and such. Margaret, do you have anything to add that you want to say?
And actually, Deidre led right into what I would like to say. So NGA has data sharing agreements with 104 countries, and we're often one of the first agreements in place because our information sharing is based mapping, based data, and safety of navigation issues. And so that's often a good place to start. And then we can also build in training opportunities where we actually send NGA analysts out to the host country and teach them various geospatial methodologies. And depending on the situation, we can also use an open source geospatial platform so that can build trust as well, because that is open code. It's not hidden behind any kind of proprietary licensing. And so that's one of the ways that we can start to build trust with NGA. And we oftentimes have multiple training opportunities, and we send, it's a nice exchange.
Do you work with the Central Statistics Bureau or the ministry that houses the Central Statistics Bureau in different countries?
It's individual to the country. A lot of countries have departments of geography. We work with departments of environmental issues. So it depends on the country.
I see. Okay.
Sarah, can I make a remark about the SDGs? It's, now that they are in play, we've walked away from it recognizing that we obviously value the role that digital technologies have to play in development, yet they don't really show up in the SDGs. There was a huge effort to try to get them. They are cross-cutting and sort of baked it in and across the others, but that didn't quite pan out. But there are a number of parallel activities going on that I think are relevant to today's conversation. One is the principles for digital development, which have been in play for the last couple of years, that we've helped put in place with FHI 360 and UNICEF and Gates Foundation and others, that now have 61 endorsing organizations rallying around 9 principles, a few of which really speak to the use of better informed data and more open data standards. And to the extent that there are rallying points around how to do this effectively, tying back to how do you bring national governments into the fold, I think the principles are a great start because they actually give you a pathway that hopefully will be pretty safe in making more effective use. The other comment on how to enable national governments to bring these tools to bear is where we've seen a lot of that pan out is on the transition from cash to e-payments and the use of digital financial services. And the Better Than Cash Alliance that we helped put together about 4 years ago now has really been impressive in bringing about think 16 or 17 national governments into its membership, saying, look, let's start converting a huge swath of your payments largely to pensioners and to pay salaries of government workers. And in doing so, you're going to start enabling greater transparency and accountability across your governments. And for ministers of finance, that has been really compelling because they want to be able to say to their folks and their populations that we are making ourselves more accountable and we're actually being more efficient and more cost effective in doing so. And I think that's something that governments, we see more and more wanting to join this alliance.
Well, this harkens back to what Wayne was saying about, the importance of mobile money. And I think Ben also mentioned that, if I'm not mistaken. So here's another question, no name, but I think it gets us circling around the relationship with host governments and international organizations. And again, we're thinking about the food insecurity and famine space. So how well are relevant technologies coordinated and or integrated across food security and famine-related agents? And I would add, so Deirdre, you started talking about this, but also if you all could reflect, who should do this? I mean, how, is it one agency or is it a group? Is it OECD? What group would be best suited to do this kind of coordination? If that's a question you can answer. I mean, some of these questions are great questions, but they may not be answerable, right? Or you could give your perspective on it. Let's not use the word answer because that implies a solution. What's your perspective on that?
That it's a
Tough
very
one.
difficult question.
It's a tough question.
Can I remove my USAID hat to provide an answer?
I wish we could use the Chatham House rules without any attribution, but there's a lot of social media going on. So.
I think with respect to this specific question, it would be extremely challenging to identify an organization that serves as the ringleader and the gatekeeper for these. And I'll look back to, again, the work we did during the height of the Ebola crisis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just given the number of actors and organizations on the ground, all there with very goodwill, wanting to address the crisis and put an end to it as quickly as possible. There was not enough coordination, we can say that, and part of it is, to my previous answer, around the lack of the tools to do that. But I'm not sure if there had been one entity that was charged with trying to bring everyone into the fold, that would have actually been more helpful in extending the coordination. I remain a fervent believer that we do each have a comparative advantage, and we should rely on the strengths regardless of our organization, and we should make sure that other organizations understand what those strengths are, and they're tapping into what we do best, we're tapping into what others do best, and that coordination piece is actually collective as opposed to just resting with one entity.
Just to follow on, is that possible? Or have you, in your experience, have you seen that happen in very time-constrained environments? You mentioned the Ebola crisis, and you've reflected on that. And Andrew also said time is a big factor with famine, right?
Right. Before I weigh in again, do either of you want to say something?
I can't say anything as regards the time-constrained environment because we're much more involved in long-term development. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't agree more with what you said about the need to focus on everyone's comparative advantage and see where the synergies lie. Mm-hmm. Because when you do get partnerships that work together, you're going to get something much bigger than what I can do on my own, and you can do in your own, and you can do in your own. It has a multiplier effect. So I would very, very much agree with what Chris said about the coordination, identifying one specific group, agency. No, you would actually probably, the famine would have passed and we would have more climate change and probably be still sitting in the desert and trying to decide who would coordinate. So I think the question is more yet to focus on how we can complement each other.
Very good. Margaret?
Well said.
But Sarah, the time-bound piece is really critical
Yeah.
here. If we're talking about data collection and making use of it, far too often now, the time between the two is just way too long to make useful work of the data. Especially if you're trying to build out a huge report or put together a big release and there's a big public event, you want to make sure that's triangulated and analyzed really well. We're talking 8 to 12 months sometimes from the point at which the data is collected. So I think there's a huge movement and a huge need for more adaptive programming, particularly in crises that come up just not quite overnight, but are really time-bound, hopefully, in their start to finish. And so we're now taking stock of our operation policies within USAID and revamping the programming part of it to try to look at more agile and adaptive programming and to actually make ourselves more of a learning organization. And one of the ways to do that is to capitalize on the tools that are available now where we can actually have more real-time data and react to it. So it's not about collecting 150 points of data. It's what are the 3 or 5 pieces of data that you need to know now that you need to be able to act upon so you actually can give it to the decision makers and get it to the folks on the ground and actually do something with that. So in the Global Development Lab at USAID, we have a development informatics team that's working with our Policy Planning and Learning Bureau to actually start turning ourselves into an organization and hopefully the broader development community that is more adaptive and responsive. And that's a really big lift. And it's not the way that we've done development traditionally, but I think it's really critical here so we actually can make awesome use of the data that we have available or that we need to make available and get a hold of to respond to.
In fact, I received an email this morning that I did answer, which was from PPL asking what were out of 3 different constraints to collaboration, learning, and adapting, what was my top? So I believe that you
I got that email
actually,
too.
Yeah, you did.
Did you answer?
No, I came here.
Okay, so I have 2 questions that are very similar that I'd like to ask you, which is, all of you deal with organizations and institutions in different countries and working toward using information to avoid human tragedy, right? So these 2 questions they say, how do you get this information out to the end user to empower them? And is there a way from sitting here in Washington or New York, working with the kind of information that you have, how do you know or how can you program, I guess, so that the end user also receives the information? Or are we just not there yet?
This is my favorite question.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and jump in. And a lot of the talk today, and I think a lot of energy enthusiasm across the field of international development is on big data, and there's a huge value there. But it really is the small data that gets us jazzed and really, I think, helps allow for more empowerment of communities in rural and hard-to-reach areas especially. And part of that small data is really what is driven by communities themselves, what is valuable to them, what is relevant to them. So we're really intrigued by taking folks who are by and large data and content consumers and turning them into data and content creators. And this builds a level of trust at the ground as well, because you're actually sourcing from folks who are saying, this is what we're seeing, this is what we need, this is how we need to be most responsible, and this is the help that we want from you all. And there are a number of examples that we won't have time to get into right now, but I'll just highlight one because it's on the top of my mind. Something that UNICEF has been doing in Uganda for the last couple years around U-Report, where they have 150,000 odd Ugandan youth and others throughout the country who are all tapped into this network. And a question goes out at a day: have you seen your extension worker this week? Are you seeing new diseases in your fields? And you're able to crowdsource overnight or within a few days, tens of thousands of responses. And we've actually seen the Ugandan government pivot in certain cases where they've reallocated budgets based on what they've seen from respondents. That's hugely empowering because it lends a voice to communities and end users, or I'm going to call them creators, and actually allows them to drive their own development agenda. And I think that's a huge component here. Are we there yet? Not by any means, but there's a lot of really exciting efforts out there that I think demonstrate a lot of hope, and I think we all can come together with a great commitment on getting us there.
I want to pick up on this point a little bit, and this ties back to the first panel as well, when there was a discussion about a company that uses crowdsourcing. So I'm wondering, does NGA use crowdsourcing at all? If you can
yes
answer
and no.
that. Okay.
Yeah. We're actually working on internal crowdsourcing, and so we're developing basically a copycat of what's available on the open systems and providing it to our Intel analysts to crowdsource their knowledge and make it available to everyone in the IC. So on that level, we're developing the processes now. But as far as on the open side, not that I know of.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Here's a good one. What are your expectations for the UN-sponsored World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul later this month to address on how it will address food shortages and potential famine prevention?
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. I think I might need a life jacket, but I think the expectation of the World Humanitarian Summit is to have a very, very visible commitment, high-level political commitment to the current crisis with respect to migration, migrants, refugees, internally displaced people. I think that would be a wonderful outcome if we had the high-level political commitment to see that we need to respond collectively to this crisis, and we also need to, we've heard so many times that we need to bridge the humanitarian development divide. And I don't think we should even consider humanitarian development divide. It should be humanitarian development continuum. And I think the World Humanitarian Summit should serve to bring world leaders together to speak out and give the prominence that the crisis that is currently ongoing. But there has been this crisis for quite some time.
Yes.
There has been. The refugees and refugee camps in sub-Saharan Africa, the tens of thousands that have been in those refugee camps, some of them for 17 years.
Yes.
It is a crisis that is now reaching boiling point, but it's been there. And the World Humanitarian Summit, I hope, will bring it out into the open, give it the high-level political commitment and will, and also make our leaders accountable for addressing it. And now I need the life check.
Maybe I'll tie it back to why we're here today too, and I think this is a great takeaway, and hopefully it's on the radars of some of the folks there in Istanbul coming up. Is we're talking about tools to do our work better. We're trying. We're grand about it. We want to change the development enterprise. We want to be more effective, but these are a set of tools, and they cut across all sectors. So we happen to be talking about food security, but the tools don't change if you're talking about refugee crises and other humanitarian crises. And the reason we can talk about it, and we're having this conversation now and not 4 years ago, is because of where the market is in a lot of countries where we work. One snapshot, since I focus on Feed the Future countries. In the 19 Feed the Future countries, between 2010 and 2015, a 5-year period, you've seen an increase by 75% of unique subscribers. One mobile, one person, one SIM. You've seen an 800% increase in the use of smartphones in that period of time in those 19 countries because the prices are coming down, they're more available. This is a market-led movement that is responding to what folks want. And we now are in a powerful position to help them because they've got the tool in their pocket or in their hand, and we just have to figure out how to leverage it and work with them to make it useful. That was not a conversation we could have a few years ago. And it's why we're having it today and why we'll continue to have it, I hope, moving forward.
Excellent. Margaret?
Just bouncing off of that, I think the U.S. government has an interesting place in all this, of course. And speaking of market dynamics, we have the opportunity to provide support and fill in where the market doesn't. And so that could be a potential growth area as well.
Well, speaking of markets, there have been a couple questions here related to the private sector and the role the private sector plays. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on partnerships and what you don't need to talk, if you can't, about your plans for partnering with the private sector, but reflect on your experiences with that relationship and how to, really draw the innovation that it can occur from a private sector business, which is responding to a market, to the longer-term strategic goals of ending hunger, malnutrition, poverty, and creating a more peaceful world, or using food for peace, as Deirdre eloquently put it.
May I come in here?
Yes.
I think the private sector is an incredible, not totally untapped potential for food security. Well beyond social responsibility and feeling that I'm doing the right thing by helping people out. And that's where, again, I would use the data and the analysis to be able to show private sector investors that they can have serious returns on their investments. And we are working very much. I mean, it was something that came out of the Financing for Development conference in Addis in July of last year. We need private sector investment. We are not going to get to where we need to get to basing ourselves on traditional donors. So we need to leverage the private sector. And we have had some very positive experiences. I'm just thinking of one in particular in Sao Tome when after the cocoa prices basically bottomed out in the late 90s, and the cocoa industry fell apart in Sao Tome, and I think there was one of the politicians there said, this is the end of the cocoa industry for Sao Tome. And we came in with an organic French organic company, an organic French company, one of those. And they conducted an assessment, and they found that the cocoa produced in Sao Tome was of such rich genetic quality that it could actually produce better chocolate. And who doesn't love chocolate?
Nobody here.
And so we also made assessments to see how we could adapt the traditional farming methods to make it organic and certified and fair trade. And now we have gone, I wish I had looked at this before I came, we have gone from I think in the space of 6 years, exporting a minimal amount to, we have, I think it's 8,000 tons, and it's gone from 700 farmers to 2,800 farmers. Please don't quote me on this because I can't, I'm trying to remember. And that was private sector investment, and it's a win-win situation. We have tea growers in India that are selling to Tesco in the UK. We have coffee growers in Nicaragua that are selling to, I can't remember who, in the US. But there's a great potential for partnership there, and we need those resources, and we need to make the income generating activities as well.
Do you see that same role with the private sector that you've described? Those are excellent examples of commodities that can be exportable. Do you see it also with domestically produced foodstuffs as well? I'm wondering, do you think that relationship can also occur productively?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, you've described the role that private sector played in being able to make commodities that are traded, cocoa, tea. I love both of them, but if I only had those, I'd starve, right? So bringing the examples that you've given, which are great, home to food security, the income gained by those farmers certainly helps.
Exactly.
Because they can buy food.
Exactly.
Presuming that there's good trade.
Yes.
And they can get their hands on inexpensive foodstuffs. But I'm wondering, is there a way to bring when we think about food security, it's governments and farmers are private sector.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So how can we build that up? Let me put it that way.
I think a lot of it is it's really tangential, and it's a couple steps removed from food production. We partner with the private sector all the time. We have to, especially if you look at flows of foreign assistance over the last couple decades. But particularly within the digital development work that USAID does, a lot of the alliances that we've put forward are to address a specific market gap or a market failure even maybe that the private sector isn't well positioned to do itself. So I usually get the question, what's the role of the public sector in expanding some of these technologies? And we come in and say, well, we can buy down the risk in a smart way so the private sector can then come in, understand the demand and where it's been generated, and then build it out and have that sustainable business model. So what we've done through the Alliance for Affordable Internet, huge consortium of tech companies, academics, nonprofit, civil society organizations, donors, is say, where can we address at a policy level affordable mobile and fixed broadband to make it available to the most underserved? In the GSMA and Women Connected Women Alliance that we put together, it was how do you reduce the mobile phone gender gap? And how do you leverage mobile network operators and their reach to close that. The Digital Impact Alliance, our most recent one, is really looking at how do you move beyond a lot of the pilots and unsustainable approaches that we've had with incorporating digital technologies and start to build them out across the wider development community so people understand the best practices and know which foot to put forward first and how. That is a market, international development market gap that we've identified, and each of those we've said there's a huge role for the private sector to do, and there's a huge role for the public sector to come in and shape it. And that's a couple steps removed, but if we're looking at communities that are doing ag production, but they need access to better information, but their connectivity isn't reliable, if we can bring a partner to bear and build out that connectivity, then the presumption is they're going to get the information they need, and that's going to translate into better productivity.
Right, and maybe more entrepreneurial
Absolutely.
activities. So, you mentioned, and thank you very much, Deirdre, for punting on that. You mentioned the power of the mobile phone, which is an enormously, I think, untapped tool, even for us here in this room. There's always a new app coming out that makes your life better, or you say my God, I can do that now. And so, I think the concern here of these questions, how do you get it to the local level? How do you get it to the local level? Is the idea that indeed at the local level, preventive actions can take place because people are given agency, they have information is power, and then they can do something. And, we're riding on this nexus of, that reality. We know that's true. We know that we have information sitting here in this room that you weigh it and then you make a decision that works for you and your family and your own personal aspirations and your community. And when you telescope that out, going up the levels of government, because we all live within a government structure, then, and we know the big data are being analyzed and looked at. We know that there are wonderful tools like the famine early warning system that produces incredibly reliable data, and people trust it. So you have the big data up here, and then you have the personal empowerment stuff down here. And I think people are just wondering, how does that connect? How does that connect? And I think that's why, if you don't mind me giving my opinion here, the questions are being asked because people are trying to constantly say, is it making a difference? Is it making a difference to that farming family, to that community where the weather is changing, where stuff is happening outside of their control, outside of even their government's control? So we have a few minutes now to ask you if you have anything you'd like to share with the audience that you haven't answered to date about the perspective that you have on transforming famine and hunger through technology and data. Margaret, do you want to say anything yet? Or are you going to listen for a minute?
I would
okay.
get a few moments.
I'll just respond to your last comment, Sarah. We just happen to be the folks up here in the chairs, but I suspect there's a lot of people here clamoring to weigh in. There's a lot of expertise here, and we have not yet built the evidence, I don't think, for how these tools can really transform agriculture and food security and practices. We have a big belief that the potential is there. We've seen through other sectors the possibilities, and we know folks are using it, but no one has really drilled down and shooken the evidence tree to see what falls out. And so I would say that's something that we're going to dive into. We would love to hear about it. So any folks who have seen the evidence, it's not going to be one piece of evidence. It's not going to be 13. It's going to be a collection of it that is then in and of itself going to have to be analyzed and interpreted. But until we really have that, and until we really capture the spirit of the foreign affairs issue that came out in January, African farmers in a digital age, and really bring that belief of what's possible to bear and translate it to what's happening on the ground, there is going to be a bit of a gap, but I think collectively we can fill that gap.
Thank you. Deirdre?
I think one of the messages that I would leave with is that this is not an exact science. It's in human nature to want to have a yes or a no answer.
Yes.
You're not going to have a yes or a no answer from data and technology. You're going to learn a lot, and it's going to be a continuous learning experience. And I, for one, wish I had stayed in university. I wish I had been a constant student. So a continuous learning experience is something that I personally welcome. Sorry. So I think it's challenging, but it's absolutely worthwhile. And that's the message I would end with.
That's a good message.
To piggyback once again off of that, the big thing is always being willing to change and to adapt. And so you can't chase the shiny object that won't help you in any way, but you have to be able to know which object to invest your time into. You have to know and understand what your goals are in order to focus on the technology, to focus on the data, to focus on the processes that will get you there. And so one of the key things with us anyway was knowing that we wanted to be, to use a phrase at my agency, to succeed in the open. We knew that we wanted to do that. And so we had to make drastic changes. We had to push our limits, and we're still pushing them, and we're going to keep doing that. And so I think having a clear understanding of what your goals are first, and then working towards the technology implementations, because there's always going to be the new tool, the new shiny thing. But as long as people stay focused on the issues that they know will make a difference and improve situations, I think that will be a good environment to work in.
Thank you all so much. Your experiences and perspectives and thoughts, I think, have been really useful because you've demonstrated, there's no perfect answer yet. We're very much working our way through how we use data to solve intractable human problems. I trained as a social scientist. At that time, it was considered a data scientist. I recognize that the data scientists today are very, very different from what I learned way, way back. And to me, it's fascinating how data now are being used as and treated as normal. Okay? There was a time when people did not trust data, and it wasn't considered normal, and you couldn't collect a lot of data. It was considered uncollectible. So I think we are in a different age. So I really appreciate the perspective and the generosity you've given this group by answering their questions, being open-minded, and coming forth to represent your institutions. Let's give them all a hand. And if you could just exit off. I'm just going to stand here because I'm mic'd up and I don't want to. I could do double mics? Okay. We are now delighted to introduce the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI as many people know it, Dr. Shenghen Fan. IFPRI provides, I guess you can't hear me? IFPRI provides policy-based solutions to end hunger, malnutrition, and poverty to developing countries. And the reason why we wanted Dr. Fan to speak today is because IFPRI generates a lot of data, and it uses big data, and it uses its research and analysis to inform developing countries about how to invest in their agricultural development so they won't have hunger, so there won't be malnutrition, and so there's a way out of poverty. So Dr. Fan's remarks will give us a window on host government priorities and needs as per how IFPRI works in this space of using technology and analysis to help address these problems. So thank you very much, Dr. Fan.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And I, as a person who suffers from hunger and malnutrition, and as head of the institute who have worked on reducing hunger and malnutrition, I want to thank you. Thank you for your great work. Thank you for your great debate. I know, the reception is waiting for us. I want to keep this very short. Firstly, the hunger and malnutrition is very costly. We know that we have 795 million people who still suffer from hunger, but don't forget there are more than 2 billion people who suffer from so-called hidden hunger, the lack of micronutrients, vitamin A, zinc, iron, and so on. And on the other hand, we have almost 1/3 of our population eat too much, overnutrition, overweight, and obesity. So you might remember in the 60s and the 70s, there was a so-called green revolution. That revolution was more triggered by biological innovation. But today I think with the biological innovation will continue. But data, ICT, will be the next revolution. I don't know whether it's green or red, whatever. It will be a very colorful revolution. Will help us to produce more food, better food, and using resources more efficiently. So I truly believe today's discussion was very useful. So I learned a lot. So a couple of issues I learned. One is satellite, remote sensing, cell phone, internet can connect a lot of data. So we can use that for the purpose of reducing hunger and malnutrition. And I also heard that these sort of micro sensors can really help to track, monitor what's going on at a very local, on ground. There's a moisture, soil texture, soil fertility, and then we can really optimize the use of inputs, fertilizers, water, energy, or maybe even reduce more carbon emission. Then market and the prices. This is something I have not heard much. I think the person from USAID said that we still need evidence to demonstrate how we can really benefit from, disseminating market price information through cell phones. I'll just give you one good example. That is Ethiopia Commodity Exchange, ECX. I don't know whether you have heard about that. So that commodity exchange, every day, almost all the time, they release the prices of coffee, maize, beans. And now with cell phones, smallholder farmers can read the price information very far away from Addis Ababa. I'm an economist. When the price information is accessible by everybody, you improve the market efficiency. The smallholders will not be cheated by so-called traders or many others. And the margins between consumer and producer prices have been reduced dramatically. Who benefited from that? Smallholders. Then extension. Again, we have seen in many countries, India, China, Africans begin to use a cell phone to access to extension knowledge. They even sent some of the, diseases or some sort of sample of the diseases from a tree leaf or crop leaf to the internet or to a cell phone. Then ask the opinion. This is outsourcing. I don't know whether we have any expert here. Or crowdsourcing, sorry. So the people will tell you, okay, so what kind of diseases you have, whether it's wheat rust fungus, or maybe recently banana tropical fall fungus. So it's just tremendous. The potential is great. Now another innovation is to use cell phone. In combination with certain medical devices, you can actually detect what micronutrients deficiency you would have, whether it's vitamin A, iron, or iron is very, very easy to detect. And this will give the programs like Harvest Plus great opportunity to target the intervention to individuals or even to certain communities, whether it's vitamin A, zinc, or iron. This Harvest Plus is a program to enhance nutrition through breeding, so by adding micronutrients to rice, wheat, maize, sweet potato, many different crops. You might know that, I'm from China. Every year during the Chinese New Year, billions of people, not just millions, billions of people move around the country. They all go home. Through the mobile phone tracking, they can detect the movement of people from where. And next year, they are going to optimize the transportation. So this is just tremendous opportunities. But challenges remain. Challenges. One challenge is the one between with and without. With and without. I'm afraid if we don't do something different, the digitization of this process probably will further divided the world between the ones who have it, between the ones who don't have it. So this is, I think many speakers have already mentioned that. So we must make sure that everybody has access to the modern tools. The second one is privacy. Yeah, we connect lots of data, and I have been surveyed by so many. I even don't know how they're going to use this data. So the privacy is an issue. How can we really balance between the privacy and the transparency, the data we wanted to share with others? And then number 3 challenge is the data we connected, at least right now, are more sort of unstructured. Unstructured is fine, but there's a lack of frequency. I think I heard from many speakers, including Andrew, well, there are lots of people who will suffer from hunger and malnutrition because of conflicts, crises, and so on. We must have more frequent data to track and monitor what's going on. Some of the nutrition data, like child stunting, UNICEF or DHS collects the data every 5 years. We cannot afford to detect certain problems to intervene after 5 years. So we must collect more frequent data. Prices, market, trade, stocks, nutrition, particularly access data, how smallholders, how poor people can access to nutritious food. We don't have good data on that. And what I have heard is more on supply side, or satellite, look at the production. IPRI actually try to make sure that we can disaggregate that data, satellite image, to very micro level data, 1 or 10 plus 10 kilometers to look at their production. Well, we use a very fancy approach to do that. But these are more on production side, supply side. Do we have a good handle on the access side, individuals? We don't. Then security. One day, I was talking to my HR head about something. Suddenly, she received an email. So could you share with me the W-2 tables of all your staff, of our staff? Then our HR head said, did you just send me an email? I said, no, I have not. It's a phishing email. Could you imagine if I didn't talk to my HR, if I just sent all our W-2 information to someone? So the security is really, really a challenge. I mean, while we are connecting all this data, how can we really make sure that the data are secure? And I think many of you have mentioned that the data should not end with the wrong hands. It's pretty dangerous to do that. So how do we move forward from here? The one is, yes, while we try to improve our security, we must share the data. We must open our data. You might know that IPRI connects lots of data, as Kimberly said, or as actually Sarah said, we connect lots of data. At household level, we have probably more than 10 countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, many programs actually funded by USAID through the Feed the Futures program. I mean, Sarah Gavian was sitting in the back. She was actually helping us to set up Nigeria and the Ghana program 5 or 6 years ago. The good news is we have surveyed probably 5,000 households, every country, every 2 or 3 years. We call it the panel data. The beauty of the panel data is you can monitor, track the progress, income, production, consumption, nutrition, health, so many indicators. And you also can analyze a causal relationship. Well, we can connect all this data through sensors, through internet, through cell phone. You really don't know the causal relationship. You can probably observe some correlation. So causal relationship is very critical for policy making. So that's one challenge. Well, another big initiative we have, actually in a proposal stage, the big data platform initiated by CGIAR, so IPRI and another CGIAR research center called CSIS are going to develop a big data platform, try to bring social, economic data and biological data together, genetic data from natural resource centers, I think Jiao and Carrie from MIPRI are sitting here. And that data, that platform, will try to bring all the data CGII has generated to share with public, share with anybody. And I think the third one is to move to individuals. Because hunger, malnutrition are evaluated at individual level, not at the national level or regional level, individual level. We better track, monitor what's going on at each individual so we can target our interventions to all these people. My last point is the capacity in converting data to policy-making evidence. So if you just have the data, you don't know how to use it. I don't think there is any value. But the capacity to translate the data to research-based evidence to policy advice will be so critical. And right now, we don't have the capacity to do that. And probably the last point is the smallholders must empower with the data information we have collected from them. We do another survey, 5,000 households in these countries. We must share the data with them if they wanted to. So if they are empowered with the data, with the information, they will be able to make better decisions for them, for their family, or for their community, for their country. Thank you very much.
In the spirit of food security, we have way too much foods for our reception, so I promise there's a reward on the end of this. Just a few themes that I heard a lot. We have too much data. We need to figure out how to share it. We need it to drive policy decisions, but we also really need the political will behind us in order to be successful. I like what Bob said in the first panel of this is a team sport. So I really do encourage you in the network reception, continue to talk to each other, continue the conversation, and let's just give one more round of applause for all of our speakers. Thank you. And the reception is just outside on the same floor where there'll be wine, drinks,